Aloha and welcome. Welcome to Think Tech Hawaii, where we're going to be showcasing today a wonderful interview as part of our Global Connections show. In Think Tech, we're raising public awareness about a range of issues from technology, energy, globalism, and diversification. In today's show, Global Connections, I'm your host, Carlos Juarez, and I'm delighted to be welcoming a very special guest coming back to us from Hawaii, Patrick Branco. Patrick is a new Foreign Service Officer with the U.S. Department of State, and he's now posted at the U.S. Embassy in Bogota, Colombia. He's returned to Hawaii as a nice break for rest and recreation, but more importantly, to share with us some of his insights as a new diplomat, part of the U.S. Foreign Service. I want to remind all of our listeners that we broadcast live on the internet at 2 and at 4 every weekday. All of our shows are streamed on ustream.tv or Spreaker.com. And if you want any links to those and any of our past shows as well, please visit us at thinktechhawaii.com. If you'd like to join us in our downtown studio gallery for any of our shows, just contact us as well at j@thinktechhawaii.com. And so we're coming to you live from Pioneer Plaza in the core of downtown Honolulu, and joined today by Patrick Branco. Patrick, very delighted to welcome you and look forward to this conversation. Welcome back. I know you've come from a long way. You're now posted in the Foreign Service down in South America, in Colombia, and look forward to learning some insights of life now in this new career that you embarked on. But perhaps if you can start by just giving us a quick snapshot. You're from Hawaii. You grew up here. Tell us a little bit about yourself and your background.
Sure. Aloha everyone, my name is Patrick Branco. I'm originally from Kailua, Hawaii. I graduated from the Kamehameha Schools in 2005, so go Warriors. After my studies at Kamehameha Schools, I headed to Hawaii Pacific University, where I double majored in international relations and political science. After my studies at Hawaii Pacific University, I was still unsure what I wanted to do, so I decided that I would try working at a law firm. So I worked as a paralegal at Kobayashi Sugita and Goda for 2 years, and after that I was very fortunate to receive a Charles B. Rangel Fellowship from the State Department, and as well as acceptance into Johns Hopkins University School of Advanced International Studies, where I focused on Korea Studies and International Economics.
Excellent. So the degree you went on to do in Washington, D.C., that's the Johns Hopkins SICE School, as it's known, really one of the, if not the premier school for international affairs, certainly long considered that. And that experience brought you quickly into this policy world in Washington, foreign policy, foreign affairs, and then suddenly you find yourself now as a new member of the State Department, the Foreign Service. You are essentially an FSO, a Foreign Service Officer, and I want to talk a little bit about that, because this is, of course, an exciting career, and given the globalizing world we live in now, the interconnectedness, you are in some ways helping to both represent and carry out the foreign policy. But tell us a little bit more about Foreign Service Officers. What is it that a Foreign Service Officer does?
Okay. So the Foreign Service is essentially the diplomatic corps of the United States, and we go abroad representing the United States as well as helping American citizens abroad. So the normal way to get into the Foreign Service is actually through the Foreign Service exam, and it's a nationwide exam that covers written as well as oral parts of the exam, and once you pass that, you enter the Foreign Service, and then you get posted by the State Department to any of the nations that we have diplomatic relations with.
So all over, and then as you go through, this is a very competitive and rigorous process. Of course, you describe the exam. I mean, every year I understand there's 10, 20,000 people who take this exam, and very small percentage who actually pass through it, who then get through an interview process for oral defense. I mean, is this something you did yourself? Because you described this other fellowship, which was another important way. This is a fellowship that you got, which essentially funded your graduate studies, but also put you on a sort of a fast track of sorts. Maybe describe a little bit more what that fellowship entailed, because in some ways you were also preparing for the career as you did your graduate degree.
Exactly. So during the 90s, there was an initiative at State Department to diversify the Department of State. We have a saying there that before the 90s, the Department of State was male, pale, stale, and Yale. Ouch. It was really dominated by those from the elite schools of the East Coast, as well as these elite families. So my specific fellowship was started by Congressman Charles B. Rangel, who served over 40 years in the House of Representatives, and he is half African American and Puerto Rican. And when he would go around the world doing all of these congressional visits, the people abroad always thought he was the driver. because the face of State Department at that time was not reflective of what the United States truly is. So he came up with this idea to recruit minorities and help diversify the State Department through this fellowship program. So I was very fortunate enough to be part Native Hawaiian and recruited to do this fellowship that funded my graduate studies, and then from my graduate studies I entered the Foreign Service.
Oh, excellent. And as part of that, again, you did a degree, basically 2 years in Washington, D.C., Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies, a program and basically an institution very well connected there to the world in Washington, policy, foreign affairs, etc. And as part of that, the Rangel Fellowship also, I believe it helped to give you some internship opportunities along the way. What were your opportunities?
Exactly. So I can understand the congressional process, the budgetary process. State Department, of course, and like every other federal agency, we depend on Congress for our budget. So one of the key elements of the Rangel Fellowship was to intern on Capitol Hill so we can see how our government works, see how our government runs. And so I was very fortunate to do an internship under Congressman Foleo Mavaenga from American Samoa. And he at the time was the chairman for the subcommittee on Asia Pacific and the global world. And I did a fellowship for there, and it was actually the perfect marriage for me because being Native Hawaiian and studying abroad in South Korea, it was perfect because Congressman Foleo Mavaenga focused on Korean issues as well as Pacific Islander issues. So that was my first summer in Washington, D.C. through the fellowship. My second internship was at U.S. Embassy Korea, and I'm a public diplomacy officer in the Foreign Service. Within the Foreign Service, you get to pick specific career tracks, and there's 5 different tracks. It's counselor, political, economic, management, and public diplomacy. We'll probably go into that a little bit more in the show, but for a public diplomacy officer, it's very essential that we understand the operation because we are dealing with the public image of the U.S. government abroad. So I was very fortunate to be in the public affairs section in U.S. Embassy Seoul.
Oh, excellent.
And then after I graduated from my master's degree, I headed into the Foreign Service.
Excellent. And of course, your first posting, let me back up by saying first, your studies, both at the university for your undergraduate at HPU, but as well as you continued in the graduate, really focused on East Asia, on Korea. And of course, where does Uncle Sam send you? Bogota, Colombia. But more to the point, let's speak briefly about that, because as you were here in Hawaii and went to do your studies at Hawaii Pacific University, you began with a clear interest in Korea, a very important player here in East Asia, and had the opportunity to study abroad there as well. Returned later to do some more advanced language training, right? And then further, that continued studies on Korea in the graduate program as well. And you know, again, someone would ask, well, why wouldn't you go to Korea? And so, what would your answer be to that?
Well, it actually wasn't my choice. The department picks for us. So within the Department of State, every Foreign Service officer or diplomat needs to have 13 characteristics, which is ability to blend, information integration, initiative and leadership. It's called the 13 points. Actually, if you look on www.state.gov and just do 13 dimensions, and it'll come up. And so within these certain dimensions, one of the characteristics is adaptability. And the State Department is really big on adaptability, so they sent me to Bogota, Colombia, and to get me out of my comfort zone so they can send me around the world as a generalist, and I'll be able to function and doing my job anywhere in the world.
Well, this is very important, and one of the things that we will explore in more detail is being a diplomat on many levels means being a jack of all trades, being resourceful, adaptable, all that. And I'm going to be particularly interested in what you see now that you've been in this position. What are the kind of skills? What are the competencies? What are the maybe traits that are important and essential for that type of role? And while we're talking about diplomats, I mean, of course, these would be also vital for anybody doing international affairs, working in the business community, even working here in the U.S., let's say, where you're interacting with a lot of people, cultural competency skills and the like. Well, I'm fascinated, and of course, the other aspect is that we're in a world now, the early 21st century, 2014, we're embarking now on a whole new year, and yet we live in a world that is both more and more interconnected on one hand, also coming to terms with new technologies, new issues. And tell us a little bit more about your specific job. You've arrived in Bogota this past summer in Colombia, and you've mentioned you're in the area more of public diplomacy, so that means connecting and engaging and maybe helping explain and clarify things to the outside world, but you're also then dealing with sort of the new information technologies, new ways of communicating. So more detail about what the nature of your work is there now in this position.
In U.S. Embassy Bogota, I'm the Assistant Information Officer, so that's within the Public Affairs section, and I'm on the press side. So we deal with the outward-facing image of the U.S. government as well as the U.S. Embassy in Colombia. So within our shop, we have the cultural side, which does, more exchanges with the Fulbright program, with study abroad programs. But on the other side, there's the press side, and that's
media
exactly. So I work on that side, and my portfolio is radio and television. So basically, if the U.S. government wants to share a story with the Colombian people, it's my job to liaison with radio and television stations and sell the story to the radio and television stations. And it goes the other way as well. If there's questions from the media, print press, radio and television, they would come and speak with us in my department, and we would explain to them our government policy lines. This is what the U.S. thinks of this, and things like that.
Yeah. So gosh, I mean, you're dealing there with a lot of different players, both the media professionals and the outside world, understanding public opinion and particularly careful the need to understand the impact that anything we might say or do will have on our relations with any country, in this case Colombia. And it's interesting because the embassy in Bogota, one would not expect to know this, but I'm fascinated to learn that it is one of our largest diplomatic posts around the world. You can assume that in Moscow or even Lagash, maybe Beijing, but Colombia. Tell us more about maybe this location. You're working there at the U.S. Embassy, which is of course a piece of our country that is representing there our interest, but it's a large piece. Tell us more about the embassy itself.
The embassy there is actually under Chief of Mission status, or under the ambassador. We have 3,400 employees actually, which makes us the second largest embassy in the world.
Wow.
And a lot of people don't think that. They, like you said earlier, they think Russia, they think China, but actually Colombia is a very strategic country for the United States and Latin America. It's one of our longest standing partners, as well as we've actually done a lot of great work in Colombia through the Department of State as well as USAID. The government of the United States has given over $8 billion to Colombia to help the country. As you know, when people think of Colombia or when people think of South America, they really do think of narco trafficking or Pablo Escobar. But because of the aid of the United States, we've actually really helped the Colombian people turn around that country. And today they're the third largest economy in Latin America, rapidly growing, 4 to 5% increase in their economy. And we actually recently just signed a free trade agreement with Colombia. Yeah. So Colombia is one of the new partners I feel that will really help dominate the world stage in the future, especially in global relations with Latin America. It's just it's fascinating.
Oh, and again, here's another aspect of it, is that we live in a world where too often, I think in the U.S., Latin America is completely neglected, on the back burner. People are not aware of what's happening. It is also important to note a Pacific country. It sits on the Pacific Ocean, and these countries like Peru, Colombia, Chile, they see themselves as part of the Asia-Pacific realm. And moreover, more specifically, China and Japan and Korea have deep connections there as well. Today, increasingly, China becoming the major investor in many of these countries, so that they are players. Moreover, I would even add that given the relative neglect that some would say the U.S. has kind of, looked the other way, where most of our energy is focused on the Middle East, on Russia, and Asia, etc. Meanwhile, Latin America, dynamic, emerging, they are also at times a bit frustrated with the U.S. Do you have a sense of that? I mean, that they are now looking elsewhere, whether it's to Asia, whether it's to Europe. Anything you could share about that?
There's always this historical memory of, the U.S. coming down with their big stick type of mentality. We've had the Monroe Doctrine for quite a while, where the U.S. basically dominates the realm within the northern and western hemisphere. But actually recently, Secretary Kerry gave a great policy speech where he proclaimed the death of the Monroe Doctrine, that the U.S. will no longer take this paternalistic view of Latin America, but see Latin America as one of our partners in the region, our partners that can help us through economic statecraft, our partners that can through educational exchanges. So That's the sense I get in Colombia nowadays, is because the country has completely turned around from, the 80s and the 90s. You were sharing with me earlier about your experience in the 90s in Colombia, but now the U.S. sees Colombia as such a dynamic partner in the region, and actually makes such great initiatives. And actually, recently, President Santos went and spoke with President Obama in D.C. Actually December 4th, and actually they had a very positive and great bilateral meeting.
Well, this is a fascinating topic. We're going to continue to unravel some of this. So we're going to take a short break right now so we can continue the show. And please join us. We're going to obviously understand more about the inner workings of the Foreign Service, the career opportunities it presents, and how a local boy, Patrick Branco, has now helping us represent our interests abroad in South America. So join us. Stay tuned, and we'll be right back in a minute.
Aloha. I'm Nicole Horry for Think Tech. For nearly half a century, the Hawaii Foreign Trade Zone No. 9 has brought the benefits of the Foreign Trade Zone program to Hawaii businesses and entrepreneurs. DBET, the Department of Business, Economic Development, and Tourism, operates Hawaii's Foreign Trade Zone program to encourage international business and economic development. The Foreign Trade Zone's mission is to increase the amount of international trading activity in Hawaii, thereby providing employment opportunities for the residents of our island state. For more information, see ftz9.org. I'm Nicole Horry. Mahalo.
Aloha and welcome back. We're live and we're Global Connections, part of the Think Tech series. I'm your host, Carlos Juarez, and joining me today is Patrick Branco. Patrick is a young new diplomat down in Bogota, Colombia, where he works for the U.S. government, the State Department, part of our Foreign Service. And, as he was beginning to unravel, and just important to underscore, here's a region, the Andean region, South America, where there's quite a bit going on, very dynamic. The economies have rebounded in recent years. We've also had a period, particularly for the United States post 9/11, where our attention has focused, well, perhaps understandably, but unfortunate for the case of Latin America, on the Middle East, on Europe, on Asia. Meanwhile, Latin America is obviously moving forward rather quickly. Here's a country, Colombia, that you've been posted to now that has a long history of relationship. In fact, even with our U.S. Peace Corps, was one of the places that was indeed one of the very active in the 1960s and into the 70s. Now, Colombia, of course, a country that we often associate with the violence and narco trafficking and the like. But give us a quick snapshot now that you've been there about a half a year. Here's a country that I think many people don't realize is quite sophisticated, quite developed and diversified. Give us a snapshot from your point of view about Colombia. What kind of place is it? About 35 million people or so?
About 35 million people.
So pretty good size.
It's a pretty large country. The interesting thing is when people think about Colombia or Latin America, they usually think of like a Spanish diaspora population there, but actually Colombia is quite diverse. They have the indigenous people that live more in the center to the south of the country, because at the southern tip of Colombia, that's where the Amazon actually starts. So it's more of an indigenous region. And more to the north, which is more towards the Caribbean Ocean, it's more Afro-Colombian population. So there's remnants still of the sad history during the slave trade, and the population is very diverse there. It's more Caribbean, I would say. It's actually they speak a lot faster. They kind of have a Puerto Rican dialect actually. And in the center, in Bogota is 8,500 feet up in the center of the country. It's more of a traditional Spanish type of population there. So overall, the country is very diverse, and actually the way the country is positioned, it actually sits on the Pacific Ocean as well as the Caribbean Ocean. So it has a very unique position within Latin America.
Yeah. No, in a long history, a country that, in fact, in previous times was actually larger. It included what is today Panama, and was part of the, I guess it would be known as the Viceroyalty of New Granada. That was the old name. Well, I'm excited because, of course, Colombia is something that's dear to my own heart. As a young academic, I spent some time in Bogota, Colombia myself, and did my own PhD studies about the country. Poorly understood, and quite often never, did fit into the models of other countries. And yet, a fascinating case. You are now part of this large U.S. embassy there, which carries on a lot of functions. And again, we have to make sure and dispel this notion that everything there is all about narco trafficking. Of course not. We have tremendous engagement on a whole range of issues. And I'm curious, one of the things that I think we see increasingly now, and I like to say is exciting for young people who are interested in foreign affairs. One option is a career like you're doing in the diplomatic service. Very limited, very hard. It's not open to everybody, but there are many other opportunities, even within our State Department, for careers and jobs that might get you there, or just other opportunities to be involved in foreign affairs. And I'm wondering if you might share just some quick reflections on this. What I also see increasingly is what we might call more people-to-people relations or diplomacy, or some of what goes on there is not just the formal government-to-government, but opening up links for NGOs, for educational exchanges and the like. Maybe you share a little bit about what kind of connections the U.S. has with a country like Colombia and how it reveals this growing dynamism of global affairs.
Actually, during the years of the Pablo Escobar years, actually we had Peace Corps volunteers that needed to be evacuated from Colombia. But actually 10 years ago, Peace Corps re-entered into Colombia, and we actually have a vibrant program there, as well as we have a great deal of Fulbright. And actually one of the big initiatives that we do now is through sports diplomacy. And we actually have a soccer player from the U.S. Olympic team. She is Mexican-American. Her name is Monica Gonzalez, and actually she comes down every year now in connection with the U.S. Embassy and set up 3 soccer schools in Medellin, Barranquilla, and Santa Marta. And actually we're getting we're engaging a lot of Colombians through sports programs now.
Fascinating.
And actually the unique thing is Secretary Kerry came down I believe in September, and one of the big things that he said is he wanted to do people-to-people connections. And instead of showcasing his big visit or his meeting with President Santos, he instead wanted to do a volunteer activity. So he actually went and saw wounded warriors. These are Colombian military personnel that have served in the Colombian military and actually lost limbs through IEDs. Because Colombia, people forget, but it's actually in a civil war.
That's right.
And he actually came down. It was quite amazing. And they play sit-down rugby in wheelchairs as well as sit-down volleyball. And actually, he put on a jersey, sat down on the ground, and he actually played volleyball. And the amazing thing is you got to see the secretary in a different light, but the more interesting thing is the press, instead of showing a picture of him shaking hands with President Santos, which is the normal picture, it was him playing volleyball, sitting on the ground and being with the Colombian people. And this just went quite crazy in the media as well as on social media, and this is the picture that they focus. So it was great, and it kind of shows the State Department is understanding that we need to start changing from more hard diplomacy type lines to more soft diplomacy. And Secretary Clinton actually coined the phrase smart diplomacy, which is a mixture of hard diplomacy as well as soft diplomacy, and so we can engage more people.
Yeah, no, I mean, ultimately that's important because, again, you also have a world where maybe 50, 100 years ago, the diplomacy that took place really was this high level between those top officials. Today, it is increasingly citizen diplomacy that's driving it and defining the relationships and, the impact of public opinion and the type of, reference you made to like social media. Today, people are plugged in and aware of things in ways that simply weren't done before. Quite fascinating. Now, describe a little bit more about your own, again, the nature of your work is in media relations, and must just be so different from what it might have been 10, 20 years ago, given the technologies and the social media. What can you say a little bit about that? I mean, how do you, what's a typical day or the kind of tasks that you end up having to do to put out information to reaching different kinds of audiences and different mediums? Share a little bit about that.
It's quite interesting. If we look back historically at State Department, under Secretary Powell, there was just one computer with internet for all the diplomats to use in one section, which is quite astonishing if you think back, but 15 years. But now we have great technologies. We are on Twitter, and we actually have one of the most vibrant Twitter feeds in Latin America. We have over 35,000 followers on Twitter. On our Facebook alone, we have 70,000. And actually, that's a major way we put out information for visas, for opportunities to study in the U.S., for just information about the U.S. This is quite interesting to us, is we had a post on National Hot Dog Day. And actually, we had over 500 shares and 5,000 likes, which is quite interesting. So Colombians, as well as in Latin America, they're interested not only in the hardline policy stuff, but about the fun culture in the United States. So these tools that we have through Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, we can be able to give some information, but also share our culture as well. So it's quite interesting.
Yeah, and of course Colombia, like so many parts of Latin America, is so deeply connected to the U.S., not only physically and geographically, but because many of the Latin American communities, they have a large diaspora in the U.S. Colombians live all around in South Florida, Miami, and New York, New Jersey, but all the major areas. And given the mobility today, many of them go and come back. They've got cousins, brothers, etc. And so it's not like in the old days where the immigrant left the homeland and never went back. Today, they go back and forth. It's a short flight to Miami, etc. And as you noted, I mean, the culture in some ways is not just a curiosity. They are part of our own culture here in the U.S. The population, I don't know the latest figures, but it's many hundreds of thousands of Colombians who live in the U.S. and many who become naturalized. I was interested when you mentioned this hot dog day. I have a memory quite odd from Colombia that I remember going to the theaters and you'd have hot dogs. They like to put crushed potato chips on their hot dogs. Where else would you see that? Very fascinating. Well, let's turn a little bit more about the world of public diplomacy is one of the aspects. You described earlier how in the Foreign Service, in the diplomatic corps that you're a part of, you end up selecting one of these sort of cones or tracks, as they would be called, whether consular affairs, and this deals with essentially supporting American citizens abroad or those who are coming to the U.S., right? Visas. You have the political, the economic, management, and then lastly the public diplomacy. And these all underscore how really the functions and operations of a foreign embassy are just so varied and complex. And not only that, but an embassy of the size you described really replicates the U.S. federal bureaucracy for all its warts and imperfections, but also what it delivers. So tell us a little bit, I mean, how is the U.S. government, functioning there? You have not just the diplomats like you, but you literally have people from every part of the government functioning down there. Describe that a little bit more.
So within U.S. Embassy Bogota, we actually have 43 federal agencies. Everything from the Department of Justice to IRS is down there. And that's one of the hardest things about my job is to make sure that all these 43 agencies are talking together and we're giving out the same voice to the Colombian public. So that's kind of sometimes herding cats when Department of Justice wants to speak with IRS and then the Department of Treasury wants to do something with the Department of Commerce. That's really the role of a public diplomacy officer, is to coordinate and that we have a consistent policy line, a consistent message to the Colombian people. And of course, we get that message from the executive branch, from President Obama.
Yeah, and even though you've got all these branches of government represented, it is the State Department that is the lead, coordinating all this, because after all, you're in this foreign country representing it. Quite fascinating. And I guess the other thing I was alluding to earlier, you've got so many opportunities these days for, in the needs of a big embassy like that, you need specialists of all kinds. You need people who understand just basic management, running the place, human resources, but everything, technical issues, security specialists, of course. I often, as I teach a lot of students interested in these type of careers, the diplomacy is one aspect, but it's a certain type of skill, and it's not for everybody. You don't want just anybody being a diplomat. You need a set of skills, and we'll talk about those in a moment. But at the end of the day, if you're a computer specialist, if you know finance and accounting, if you know real estate or something, very specialized, there is an opportunity somewhere. And do you, as you see these others who work there, you see part of a team that all these different pieces come together, and yet you stand out as one piece of that, which is the Foreign Service officer himself or herself. You describe this large embassy, but what percentage of them are actual, like yourself, FSOs as they're called?
As for FSOs, I would say about 100 of us are Foreign Service generalists, and we have about maybe 600 Americans, and the majority of the population that actually works with us are Colombian locally employed staff, because we do, the United States will come with, with us, the traditional diplomats, but also we need people who understand Colombia. So we actually work with a great deal of Colombians. On my staff alone, I manage 6 Colombians, and one is a human rights lawyer, the other one is a media specialist. I have a social media person as well, and they actually help advise us so we can reach out to the Colombian population and understand in in greater detail. Also there, within the Foreign Service, there are Foreign Service generalists and there's Foreign Service specialists. As you were saying earlier, Dr. Juarez, there's people that we need to have out there to help us normal generalist type of diplomats. So within the Foreign Service specialist category, we have doctors there, we have engineers there, we have architects there, and they're also diplomats, but just more specialized. So it's a team that we work together. Some of us deal with the policy stuff, but a lot of us help other diplomats help support us to make sure the embassy has water, we're functioning.
Yeah,
So
no,
it's a big operation.
Big challenge. Well, we're going to take another short break, but continue this fascinating dialogue, and in particular, as we come back, learn a little bit more. What are the skills, the competencies, the traits that really make a successful diplomat? Very important, and something that Patrick Branco will continue our conversation. So stay tuned. We'll be back in just a moment.
I'm Hong Jiang, host for Asia in Review on Tuesdays.
And I'm David Day, host for Asian Review on Thursdays. Both of us broadcast our respective shows at 4 p.m.
And my topics tend to deal with questions related to environment, culture, history, and sometimes human rights.
And my shows tend to be on international business, foreign policy, geopolitics, and national security. And you can watch our shows live on the ThinkTech website at thinktechhawaii.com.
And you can also watch us on YouTube or Olalo.
So come join us on Thursdays at 4 p.m. I'm David Day.
And on Tuesdays at 4 p.m., I'm Hong Jiang.
Aloha.
Aloha.
And we're back, we're live, and we're Think Tech Hawaii. This is Global Connections, the show brought to you by Think Tech Hawaii. I'm your host, Carlos Juarez, and delighted to be joined today by Patrick Branco. Patrick, one of our local boys who's come from Kailua and now is helping to implement American foreign policy in his new position as a diplomat. He's posted in his first posting in Bogota, Colombia, South America. Beautiful country up in the Andes with a very rich history and diverse geography, culture. Fascinating, and a very large functioning embassy where, of course, we have a complex set of issues going on. I want to talk now, just as we continue, a little bit more about diplomacy and what it entails. I mean, it's a complex set of issues. On one hand, you need specialists, you need generalists, but maybe if you could share a little bit, now that you're a formal diplomat and have gotten into this career, what are some of the skills and traits and needs? I mean, what makes a successful diplomat?
I've actually gone around and spoke with a few high schools students around here, and they always ask, well, I'm not good with languages. But that's actually not the core skill for diplomats. It's actually being able to understand and be able to function well in different cultures. Computing skills, as I said earlier, there's the 13 dimensions, and these are the 13 dimensions that each Foreign Service officer has to have, which is cultural adaptability, computation skills, initiative and leadership. And that's what actually the Foreign Service is looking for. People that can function in other cultures, but also take initiative. And people always think languages and just studying cultures, but my classmates that I entered within my diplomatic class actually were from a wide range of careers. Of course, there's always the disgruntled lawyer who joins the Foreign Service, but there's also those who, I have one colleague, and she was a scientist for the National Oceanic Administration. And actually right now on vacation, she's up in Iceland taking ice samples. So the Foreign Service attracts a lot of different people, and that's one of the great things about the Foreign Service. Yeah, we're in another country and we're meeting new cultures, but the people you work with, they're so dynamic. Another member of my class was the former mayor of his town. Was the mayor for about 15 years, 60-year-old, and decided to see the world. And he joined the Foreign Service. So the Foreign Service...
Never too late.
Exactly. The Foreign Service always attracts a different type of person, and you never know who you're going to work with, because we have to move every 2 years.
Yeah, and you mentioned at the outset, I mean, part of you've come in really what is a very important critical juncture for us. The U.S. diplomatic service for so long was often criticized, and rightfully so, as being so narrow and sort of homogeneous and sort of, small world of sort of New England Ivy Leaguers. And on one hand, yeah, sure, they've got a certain set of maybe almost, a certain groupthink that comes together, which is itself problematic. But at the end of the day, big country that we are, we need a diverse foreign service that represents who we are, that can also show the face of the U.S. abroad. You come from Hawaii, you were born and raised here, you've got a certain set of values and beliefs, and what does it mean for you as a diplomat from Hawaii maybe more specifically, what do you think your experience as someone from Hawaii helps? I mean, the adaptability seems obvious. You've worked with a lot of cultures here, but in what ways can you say your upbringing here has helped?
I think what really helps is my relationships with my coworkers. It's really interesting when you get in an office with someone from New York who's really fast-paced, kind of strong, and then you have to kind of, show them that there's a middle ground, show them that it's always not here now, we have to do things. Hawaii actually really taught me how to deal with different types of people. For example, people from New York, people from the East Coast, very different. People from the South, they're not the best people to have in a meeting because they speak a lot slower. So again, Hawaii has taught me how to have patience, to show aloha to those people. So I think that was one of the major things. Coming from Hawaii helped me just kind of have that inner calm, that inner peace that helped me deal with a lot of different people.
Interesting. Some people have noted, President Barack Obama, spent much of his childhood here too, and that many have said that, well, to understand him and his views, his values, his way of doing, you need to understand the world that he came from. I mean, how would you see that? Is it you have a sense in seeing him? He's the commander of our forces. He's the president. He's the head of our executive branch. I mean, do you think he brings with him some set of values that came from his Hawaii upbringing?
I definitely see that he does bring a great, strong set of values. If you listen to President Obama, he's very calm, he's very logical in the way he thinks, and I kind of feel that Hawaii kind of helped bring that. Maybe Chicago perfected him with the way he speaks and the way he reaches out to the community, but I think with his mannerisms, I definitely think that's very, very Hawaiian in the way he approaches problems. As our president, it's a very unique opportunity now, because now when we reach out to indigenous populations or Afro-Colombian populations, we can actually showcase, look at President Obama, look, he's African American, and it actually gives a real sense of hope to these people who come from underprivileged communities, that they see someone who is similar to them.
Interesting. And you present yourself, of course, as you meet with people in a place like Colombia. You're an American, you're Hawaiian, and I mean, what kind of responses do you get as people learn, well, you're Patrick Branco, you've got this, you don't seem like the Ivy Leaguer on the one hand, but you're from Hawaii, and that, as often is the case, it's exotic, it's different. What are some, either responses you've had or ways that you've somehow articulated what it means to be Hawaiian?
It's actually very interesting. In Colombia, I actually blend in. So when I'm going at events or other functions, a lot of people think I'm Colombian. But when they hear my accent in Spanish, they're like, oh, look at this gringo, actually. But the other interesting thing, though, is that when I deal with other U.S. diplomats as well, actually my first week there, I went to a function with the Colombian Foreign Ministry, and actually 5 U.S. diplomats came and introduced themselves and asked me which department at the Foreign Ministry that I work in. And I think that's very interesting for me, because not only showing Hawaii on the world stage, but I get to show Hawaii to my coworkers, to other Americans that actually should understand all the diverse regions of the United States.
Yeah. No, that's a very interesting point. You are, of course, reflecting it not just to the world, but even to our own internal diplomatic community. And it's been fascinating to learn about this. The ins and outs, and you've described somehow these various dimensions, the characteristics, the traits, and yet some of them, of course, are things you do either need to learn or perfect along the way. I mean, there's certain skills and qualities that one might have just from your life experience, but beyond that, the Foreign Service itself is training you, giving you insights, giving you, you're learning from other mentors and peers. I mean, if you reflect now, and even as a young diplomat yourself, I mean, are there any things that stand out as things that you either wish you knew earlier, or that you have, something that just stands out as you've learned the importance of this or that, something you didn't realize was so important?
Definitely writing skills. The people back in Washington don't always have the time to read everything you write. And we're actually the subject matters, and we want to share all this information that we learned from Post. But that's one of the real skills that I had to narrow down, is being able to write in a very short, concise manner. And making sure that, for example, Secretary Kerry, he's in the elevator from the 1st floor to the 7th floor, so they always say that you need to write something that he can read from the 1st floor to the 7th floor. So that was one of the skills that I had to hone down. Skills that I brought from Hawaii were definitely I was very fortunate at Kamehameha. They really wanted us to be well-rounded, so I took art history there. And I remember seeing paintings from Botero. And being in Colombia, Botero was a famous Colombian painter, and actually I could recognize that. And the Colombians were very impressed with it, like, oh, actually, you know Botero?
Yes.
So that's a lot of great skills. Like, people don't think that art history, world history comes in, but it does play a significant part when you're dealing with a lot of different people from around the world. And you're going to sense that more and more with a globalized world. You're going to need to know different cultures. You're going to need to know how to interact with different people. So I think it's a very important skill.
Yeah, and along those lines, I mean, you know, the Foreign Service exam, which is one of the main avenues to get in, is a test of many different things, not just world affairs and obvious things like that, but management, popular culture, literature, history. These things are important because in that world, you've got to be able to connect with people. And not only do you need to know that art history, but you also need to know something about social media these days that, you know, people might be more interested in learning. Well, these have been fascinating topics, and I'm really grateful to the opportunity to meet with you. And well, as you're back here for a short break, as part of the diplomatic, I guess, service, you get a rest and recreate, R&R as you call it, to come back and also keep you grounded and connected with your own family and roots, and certainly recharge your aloha spirit. And so very fascinated, Patrick. A great conversation to learn more about the State Department, your new career, and how you're in effect helping to spread aloha in this new role. We're going to close on that. It's been a fascinating conversation. We've joined here by Patrick Branco, who comes to us from Bogota, Colombia, his new home. He's based there as a U.S. diplomat in the U.S. Foreign Service, and of course his roots are always here. You can't take that away from you, and very excited to learn really some of the challenges, some of the exciting work that goes on in a career like this. So we're going to close on that. I want to just wrap things up. We're out of time, unfortunately, but we will be back as we are on a regular basis. Global Connections, part of the Think Tech Hawaii radio series, talking here with Patrick Branco. I want to thank many others who helped make this show possible. We have Ian Montana, our communication director, Chrissy Goffigan, who helps put out a lot of the media news, Jay Fidel, who of course helped bring it all together for us. And I want to thank you, our listeners, for listening and joining me today. Think Tech will be back in our next show coming up in the Think Tech series. Stay tuned. You can get all the information on our website, thinktechhawaii.com. And for any of those, if you want daily advisories or social media program advisories, they're all listed there. And just remember as well that we broadcast live every weekday at 2 and at 4 p.m. And all of our shows are saved as YouTube files as well. So stay tuned, and we'll look forward to connecting next time on our show, Global Connections. Aloha, everyone.
Aloha.